People often say the coldest place on earth is not the Arctic, but a place without love. And when the incense at my grandfather's funeral had not yet burned out, I understood what that bone-chilling cold truly meant. His casket had not yet been lowered into the ground. The pastor was still reciting prayers. Then a black Cadillac Escalade pulled up at the end of the dirt road. A silver-haired woman in a gray suit stepped out. Glenda Thornton, president of the Oak Ridge Meadows HOA for 18 consecutive years. She was not there to pay her respects. She came with an appraiser and a sign to sell the farm. 1,200 acres of land, $15 million. A contract my grandfather had supposedly signed voluntarily for $1. But she did not know one thing. My grandfather was old, but he was not senile. He had recorded everything. Comment below where you are watching from. The crunch of tires on gravel cut through the pastor's prayer like a blade. I turned from my grandfather's open grave, still gripping the white rose meant for his casket, and watched a black Cadillac Escalade roll to a stop at the end of the dirt path. The driver's door opened. Glenda Thornton stepped out in a charcoal suit that cost more than most neighbors earned in a month. Her silver hair cropped short and precise. She did not glance toward the funeral. She did not acknowledge the 37 mourners gathered around a man who had lived in this community for 82 years. Instead, she turned to the man climbing out of the passenger seat, a younger guy with a clipboard and measuring device, and they walked toward my grandfather's gate like they already owned everything behind it. My stomach dropped. This was not a condolence visit. This was a takeover. My name is Ethan Whitfield. I am 36 years old, an architect from Denver who has not set foot on this farm in 12 years. That absence is not something I am proud of. Life happened the way it always does, with deadlines and excuses that seemed reasonable until they were not. My grandfather understood, or at least he said he did during our weekly phone calls. Walter Whitfield was 82 when he died, a widower living alone on 1,200 acres since my grandmother passed in 2015. He never complained, but 2 months ago, he called at 11 p.m., something he had never done in my entire life. His voice was strange, almost frightened. "Ethan, that Thornton woman keeps bringing tea to the house. Every time I drink it, I wake up hours later and cannot remember anything. I am scared, son." I told him to see a doctor. I told him I would visit soon. I did not visit soon enough. I handed my rose to a cousin and walked toward the gate, my shoes sinking into the soft October earth. By the time I reached them, Glenda was supervising, while her companion hammered a metal sign into the ground beside the mailbox my grandfather had built with his own hands in 1973. The sign declared in bold letters that 1,200 acres of prime agricultural land were for sale by order of Oak Ridge Meadows HOA. I stopped, 3 feet away. "What the hell do you think you are doing?" Glenda turned with a smile that carried no warmth. "Ethan, is it? I am so sorry for your loss." Walter was a valued neighbor. She gestured at the sign like it was a community improvement project. "I know this seems abrupt, but we have legal obligations. Your grandfather signed a voluntary land transfer agreement 5 weeks ago. This property now belongs to the association." She reached into her handbag and handed me a manila folder. Inside was a single page that made my blood run cold. The document stated that Walter James Whitfield voluntarily transferred all rights to 1,200 acres, a property worth $15 million at current market rates, to Oak Ridge Meadows HOA for the sum of $1. $1 for the land my great-grandfather had cleared with his own hands. $1 for 4 generations of Whitfield history. At the bottom was my grandfather's signature, shaky and uneven, alongside a thumbprint smeared in black ink. The agreement had no notary seal, no independent witness signature, no competency assessment, which Colorado law requires for property transfers involving anyone over 75. This document would not survive 10 minutes in a legitimate closing office. Yet, Glenda stood there acting like it was a done deal. "This is not a legal transfer," I said, keeping my voice level. "There is no notarization, no witness. You are telling me my grandfather signed away $15 million for $1, and you think that holds up?" Her smile flickered but held. "Walter was of sound mind. We met privately, and he made tea for me himself. The transfer finalizes in 21 days. I suggest you collect your personal belongings from the house before then." I felt my Uncle Raymond appear beside me before I saw him. He was 58, my father's younger brother, and he had driven from Wyoming for the funeral. I expected him to erupt. Raymond's temper was legendary in our family, the kind of man who once threatened a contractor with a shovel over a billing dispute. Instead, he stood with his shoulders hunched forward, his eyes fixed on the dirt, his jaw tight but silent. When Glenda nodded at him, he nodded back. Just barely, but he did. Then he stepped away without saying a word. That was wrong. Everything about his posture screamed that he knew something, and whatever it was had turned my loud, confrontational uncle into a man who could not meet my eyes. Glenda noticed my reaction, and her smile widened slightly before she turned back toward her Cadillac. "The HOA thanks you for your cooperation," she said over her shoulder. The engine started, the black SUV pulled away, and the sign remained, planted in my family's soil like a flag claiming conquered territory. I walked back past the mourners who whispered among themselves, past Raymond, who had retreated to his rental car and sat staring at his phone. The farmhouse was unlocked, as it always had been. My grandfather never believed in locking doors. I went straight to the kit doctor, William Patterson, moving on instinct more than logic, and stopped at the counter beside the stove. There it was. A small amber prescription bottle sitting next to the coffee maker, exactly where I had noticed it that morning, without really registering what it meant. I picked it up. The label read Zolpidem, 10 milligrams, a powerful sedative commonly sold as Ambien. The prescribing doctor's name was unfamiliar. The patient's name was not my grandfather's. Someone had brought this into his house. Someone had been drugging an 82-year-old man who lived alone, a man who called me terrified 2 months ago, saying he could not remember things after drinking tea. I set the bottle down carefully, as it might explode. Then I remembered the letter he sent 2 weeks before he died. Most of it was ordinary grandfather talk about the weather and wheat prices. But the last paragraph said, "If anything happens to me, check the camera system in the storage shed. I have been recording things. And do not trust anyone who brings tea." At the time, I thought it was paranoia. Now I understood it was evidence. My grandfather knew someone was coming for him. He tried to protect himself. And whoever did this had made one critical mistake. They thought a dying old farmer was too senile to fight back. The morning after my grandfather's funeral, I drove to the county sheriff's office with a folder containing photographs of the sign, a copy of the fraudulent transfer document, and notes on every legal violation I could identify. The deputy at the front desk glanced at my materials for about 30 seconds before picking up the phone. "Sheriff Hancock, there is a Whitfield here about the HOA." The way he said my name told me this conversation had already been discussed. Sheriff Dale Hancock was 56 years old, with a gut straining against his uniform and a handshake designed to establish who was in charge. He led me to his office, gestured at a chair, and sat behind his desk without touching my folder. "Ethan, right? Sorry about Walter. Good man." He leaned back. "Now, what is this about Glenda?" I laid out everything the sign posted during the burial, the document lacking notarization or witnesses, the unrecorded transfer, the prescription bottle that was not my grandfather's. Hancock listened with his fingers steepled, nodding at intervals that felt rehearsed. When I finished, he let the silence stretch before responding. "Son, I have known Glenda for 15 years. My wife Meredith sits on the HOA board. What you are describing does not match the woman I know." I kept my voice level. "I am not asking you to take my word for it. I am asking you to investigate. My grandfather supposedly signed away $15 million for $1, and the next day he was hospitalized with symptoms consistent with sedative poisoning." Hancock stood, signaling the conversation was over. Walter was 82. Old folks get confused, make decisions that their families do not like. "I will note your concerns, but I am not going to harass a respected community leader based on speculation from someone who has not visited his grandfather in 12 years. He walked me to the door with a hand on my shoulder that felt more like a warning than comfort. As I stepped into the hallway, I heard him settle back into his chair. I did not hear him pick up the phone, but I knew what would happen next. By the time I reached my truck, Glenda Thornton would know exactly what I had said. A certified letter was waiting in my mailbox when I returned to the farm. The return address read Crane and Associates, Attorneys at Law. I opened it in the driveway, my hands not quite steady. Philip Crane, legal counsel for Oak Ridge Meadows HOA. informed me that pursuant to the voluntary land transfer agreement dated September 18th, my presence on the property constituted trespassing. I had 21 days to vacate or face legal action, plus liability for damages to HOA property during my unlawful occupation. The letter was copied to the sheriff's office. They were not just taking the land, they were trying to make me a criminal for standing in my grandfather's house. I sat on the porch steps and read the document 3 more times, searching for weaknesses. That was when I noticed a clause buried in the dense legal language. The receiving party reserves the right to transfer, sell, or assign the property to third-party entities for development purposes. If the HOA wanted this land for community use, why would they need the right to sell it to developers? My Uncle Raymond's truck pulled into the driveway around noon. He climbed out slowly, approaching like a man walking towards something he dreaded. "Ethan, we need to talk." I held up the lawyer's letter. "Did you know about this?" He looked at the paper, then at the house, then finally at me, but only for a second before his eyes dropped again. "Your grandfather made his decision. He wanted that land to go to the community." I stepped closer. "Raymond, someone drugged him. I found zolpidem in his kit, Dr. William Patterson, which was not prescribed to him. He called me 2 months ago, terrified because he kept blacking out after Glenda brought him tea." Something crossed his face, there and gone, guilt or fear compressed into a single flinch. "You have been away a long time," he said quietly. "Just sign what they want and go back to Denver, please." He was already turning toward his truck. "It is not worth it, Ethan. None of it is worth what they will do." He drove away without looking back, and I stood in the dust, wondering what exactly had been promised to make my uncle abandon his own father's memory. That evening, I checked the community message board. The HOA newsletter had gone out to 2,800 households, featuring Glenda's tribute to my grandfather and his generous decision to donate land for the community's future. The comments were predictable in their cruelty. One called me a typical millennial chasing inheritance money. Another claimed my grandfather had personally complained about his ungrateful nephew who never visited. The worst had over 400 reactions. "This grandson is faking grief to steal Walter's estate. The HOA should sue him for defamation." I set my phone down and looked at the wheat fields stretching toward the mountains. In less than 24 hours, the sheriff had dismissed me, lawyers had threatened me, my own uncle had warned me to run, and neighbors I had never met had declared me a fraud. The system had closed ranks with remarkable efficiency, but they had made a calculation error. They assumed I was the same person who had stayed away for 12 years, too busy with my life in Denver to fight for anything here. They assumed grief and isolation would send me running back to a city where none of this was my problem. They did not know that my grandfather had seen this coming. 2 weeks before he died, he sent me a letter, mostly ordinary talk about weather and wheat prices. But the final paragraph was different. "If anything happens to me, check the camera system in the storage shed. I have been recording things, and do not trust anyone who brings tea." At the time, I thought it was paranoia. Now I understand it was preparation. My grandfather knew someone was coming for his land. He knew the system would not protect him. So he built his own protection, frame by frame, hidden in a shed nobody had reason to search. Tomorrow morning, I was going to find out exactly what he left behind. The storage shed behind the farmhouse had not been opened in years. Rust had sealed the padlock, and I needed bolt cutters to get inside. The morning light revealed old farm equipment, boxes of tax records, and enough dust to trigger a coughing fit. What I did not expect was the camera system mounted in the corner, partially hidden behind a stack of feed bags. An old analog setup, the kind that recorded to VHS tapes. 2 cameras were wired to it, their cables running through holes drilled in the shed wall toward the main house. My grandfather had installed surveillance without telling anyone, and based on the wear patterns, he had done it recently, but the VCR unit was missing. The cables ended in space where the recorder should have been. Someone had taken it. Someone who knew exactly what those tapes would show. I searched for an hour. The shed, the house, the barn. Nothing. But in my grandfather's desk drawer, tucked between utility bills, I found a receipt dated September 12th from an electronics store in town. 1 VCR player recorder, $89, cash, 6 days before he supposedly signed over his entire property. He had bought new equipment to record something specific, and someone had made sure those recordings disappeared. I photographed the receipt and drove to the county seat to do what I should have done from the beginning, verify whether any of this was actually legal. The county recorder's office smelled like old paper and bureaucratic routine. Nancy Aldridge, the clerk who helped me, was a patient woman in her mid-40s who seemed genuinely interested when I explained what I was looking for. She typed for a moment, then frowned. I am showing no recorded transfers for that parcel since 1992, when Walter Whitfield's mother passed, and the deed transferred to him. I showed her the HOA's agreement. She studied it with the careful attention of someone who processed these documents daily. This is not a valid transfer instrument, she said flatly. No notary acknowledgement, no witness signatures. Our county also requires a competency assessment for any grantor over 75 in transactions involving agricultural land exceeding 100 acres. She handed the paper back. Whoever drafted this was counting on no one checking. I spent 3 hours at the county law library, pulling everything relevant. The Colorado Common Interest Ownership Act was dense, but the key sections were unambiguous. An HOA could not claim private property through a signed agreement alone. There had to be recorded deeds, proper consideration, and compliance with state requirements. Glenda's document failed every test. More critically, I found Colorado Revised Statute Section 18-6.5-103, exploitation of an at-risk adult. The statute defined it as using deception or undue influence to obtain control of property from anyone over 70, or anyone with impaired capacity to protect themselves. Class 3 felony. 4 to 12 years. My grandfather was 82 and had been hospitalized with symptoms of sedative poisoning. If I could prove that Glenda had drugged him before obtaining that signature, this would stop being a property dispute and become a criminal case. The hospital gave me limited access to records as my grandfather's emergency contact. Dr. William Patterson, the attending physician on September 19th, remembered the case clearly. Mr. Whitfield was brought in by a neighbor who found him disoriented in his driveway. He could not remember how he got there or what day it was. His symptoms were consistent with sedative intoxication, specifically something in the Z drug family like zolpidem. The doctor paused. He had no prescription for any such medication. When I asked if he had taken anything, he said a friend had brought him tea that afternoon, and he felt strange afterward. Tea. The same word my grandfather had used when he called me 2 months ago. Terrified. I kept my expression neutral, but something cold settled in my chest. This was no longer a suspicion. This was a pattern. I recommended follow-up with his primary care physician. Dr. William Patterson continued, and suggested he avoid accepting food or drinks from anyone until we understood what happened. I documented everything. I asked why he had not reported it. He shook his head. He was alert at discharge, without evidence of ongoing abuse. My hands were tied, but the record is there if someone needs it. I obtained copies before I left, back in my truck. I laid out the timeline like evidence on a courtroom table. September 12th, my grandfather purchases a VCR, preparing to document something he expects to happen. September 18th, 2:23 p.m. He allegedly signs away $15 million in land for $1. September 19th, he arrives at the emergency room, unable to remember the previous day, and blood work is consistent with sedative poisoning. The VCR he bought 6 days earlier vanishes from his property. The document he supposedly signed has no notary, no witnesses, and no competency verification. An 82-year-old man was drugged, his signature extracted while he was incapacitated, and the evidence destroyed. This was not elder confusion. This was calculated theft with a paper trail they thought no one would follow. I dialed Adult Protective Services and waited through 2 transfers before reaching an intake specialist. I need to report a case of elder abuse involving my grandfather, Walter Whitfield, who died last week in Oak Ridge County. I have hospital records confirming he was admitted with sedative poisoning on September 19th, one day after someone obtained his signature on a property transfer worth $15 million. The document lacks every legal requirement for validity, and the recording equipment he purchased 6 days prior has been removed from his home. I paused to let that register. The people responsible believe he was too old and too dead to fight back. I am calling to inform you that they were wrong. The email had been sitting in my spam folder for 6 weeks. My grandfather had forwarded it to me on September 3rd, 3 weeks before he died, with no subject line and no message, just a forwarded chain he must have received by accident. The kind of mistake that happens when someone clicks a reply all without checking recipients. At the time, I glanced at it, saw corporate letterhead and legal jargon, assumed it was spam targeting elderly people, and moved on. Now, sitting at my grandfather's kit doctor, William Patterson table at 2 a.m., I read it for the first time. The header showed it originated from Victor Harlan, CEO of Pinnacle Development Corporation, sent to Glenda Thornton with several HOA board members copied. The subject line read, Oak Ridge Expansion Final Acquisition Timeline. The body of the email dismantled everything I thought I understood about what had happened to my grandfather. The message was dated August 28th, 3 weeks before the transfer agreement was signed. Victor Harlan wrote that Pinnacle was prepared to move forward with a $15 million purchase of consolidated Oak Ridge parcels, contingent on the acquisition of the Whitfield property, described as the Central Corridor, without which the development would not be viable. The HOA's consulting fee of $900,000, 6% of the transaction value, would be distributed upon closing. A reply from Glenda, sent the same day, confirmed her understanding. She wrote, The old man Whitfield is the last obstacle. I will handle him personally this month. Have my $450,000 ready. There it was, not community development, not neighborhood improvement, a $900,000 payout split among board members, with Glenda claiming half for being the one willing to do what needed to be done. That single sentence reframed everything: the rushed timeline, the legally deficient document, the sedatives in his system the day after he allegedly signed. I scrolled through the rest of the chain. References to previous acquisitions surfaced. Other elderly landowners who had voluntarily transferred properties to the HOA over the past 3 years. A pattern emerged. Glenda had been systematically approaching isolated seniors on agricultural parcels adjacent to Oak Ridge Meadows, obtaining signatures on transfers for token amounts, then flipping those lands to Pinnacle at market value. My grandfather's 1,200 acres were the final piece. Without his property, the development could not proceed, and the HOA would forfeit a $500,000 deposit already paid to secure the deal. That explained the urgency at the funeral. They were not just greedy, they were desperate. The clause I had noticed in the transfer agreement now made perfect sense. The receiving party reserves the right to transfer, sell, or assign the property to third-party entities for development purposes. That language was not standard. It was a mechanism specifically designed to enable the immediate flip to Pinnacle. They had probably drafted it months before my grandfather ever saw it. All they needed was his signature, obtained by whatever means necessary when he would not give it willingly. I thought about my Uncle Raymond, his silence at the funeral, his refusal to meet my eyes, his warning to sign whatever they wanted and disappear. I opened my phone and scrolled to the day of the burial. Raymond had received a call from an unknown number at 11:47 a.m., roughly 30 minutes after Glenda drove away. The call lasted 12 minutes. I could not prove what was discussed, but the timing suggested coordination. If Glenda had offered him a piece of the consulting fee in exchange for keeping me quiet, it would explain why my uncle had abandoned his own father's memory without a fight. I pulled out my grandfather's handwritten will from the document folder. It was dated September 10th, 8 days before the transfer agreement, witnessed by 2 neighbors whose signatures I recognized. The will was unambiguous. Walter James Whitfield left his entire estate, including the property at 1472 Rural Route 15, to his grandson Ethan Whitfield, with explicit instructions that the land remain in the family and never be sold to developers or corporate interests. A personal note at the bottom, written in his increasingly shaky handwriting, said, "Ethan, I know I do not have much time. That Thornton woman thinks I am old and confused, but I am sharper than she knows. Check the camera system in the storage shed. I recorded everything. Whatever papers they wave around, do not believe them. This land belongs to our family." He knew what was coming. He bought recording equipment on September 12th. He wrote a will that specifically contradicted any transfer to developers. He forwarded me that email, probably hoping I would pay attention. And when they came for him anyway, when the tea made him drowsy, and the pen was pressed into his hand, he left me a trail to follow. The question was whether I could find the evidence before they realized it still existed. Glenda had taken the VCR from the storage shed, but my grandfather was not a careless man. 67 years of farming had taught him to prepare for trouble, to keep backups, to hide things that mattered in places no one would think to look. The cameras were still mounted in the shed. The wires still ran toward the house. Somewhere on this property, there was a recording of what actually happened on September 18th. The footage existed. I just had to figure out where an 82-year-old man, fighting against people who thought his age made him weak, would hide the one thing that could bring them down. Attorney Rachel Donovan's office was in a converted Victorian house in downtown Colorado Springs. The walls lined with framed newspaper clippings about homeowners who had beaten HOA overreach. She was 42 years old, sharp-eyed, and she listened to my entire story without interrupting once. When I finished, she leaned back and said, "They picked the wrong family to steal from." She agreed to take my case on contingency before our first hour ended. "What you are describing is not just fraud," she said, spreading the documents across her desk. "This is systematic exploitation of vulnerable adults. If we can prove Glenda Thornton used sedatives to incapacitate your grandfather before obtaining his signature, we are looking at a Class 3 felony under Colorado Revised Statutes Section 18-6.5-103, 4 to 12 years. We built our counterattack over 3 days. Rachel filed a complaint with the Colorado Division of Real Estate, documenting every procedural violation, missing notarization, absent witnesses, no competency assessment for grantors over 75. The cease and desist letter demanded immediate removal of the sale sign and cessation of all actions related to the alleged transfer, citing 7 specific violations and warning that continued interference would trigger civil action for trespassing, defamation, and intentional infliction of emotional distress. Copies went to Philip Crane, Sheriff Hancock, and the county recorder. Then Rachel called a contact at the Colorado Attorney General's office. "These emails showing the Pinnacle deal are explosive," she told me afterward. "If board members were taking consulting fees on property acquired through fraud, that is criminal conspiracy." The financial pressure on the HOA was worse than I had understood. Public records showed Oak Ridge Meadows had signed a memorandum of understanding with Pinnacle Development 6 months earlier, committing to deliver consolidated parcels within a specific timeline. The deadline was 60 days from my grandfather's death. Failure to complete the transfer meant forfeiting their $500,000 deposit plus potential liability of $2 million in liquidated damages. Glenda and her board were not just greedy, they were cornered. Every day without my signature brought them closer to catastrophe, which explained the aggression at the funeral. It also meant they would become more dangerous as the deadline approached. I needed the video evidence, and I needed professional help. Rachel connected me with Marcus Webb, a 38-year-old forensics specialist who had spent a decade with the FBI before going private. He arrived from Denver the next morning in a van full of equipment. "Analog systems are harder to destroy than people think," he said, examining the camera setup in the storage shed. "Digital files can be wiped clean, but magnetic tape holds information even after someone tries to erase it. If the tapes exist, I can likely recover usable footage." He traced the wires through the wall into the main house, then stopped. "These cables run to 2 locations. One goes to where the VCR was, but there is a secondary line branching toward your kit Dr. William Patterson floor. The root cellar, a space accessible through a hatch I had walked over 100 times without thinking, a place I had not searched. Raymond's truck appeared at the end of the driveway that afternoon. He parked like he was not sure whether to come closer. I walked out to meet him, and we stood in silence. 2 men bound by blood and divided by something neither wanted to name. "I know about the phone call," I said. 30 minutes after the funeral, 12 minutes long." His face went pale. His hands shook as he reached for the truck door, but he did not climb in. His shoulders dropped instead. "She said it was a finder's fee," he whispered. "She said he had already agreed. All I had to do was keep you from causing problems." He paused. $75,000. I have not made my mortgage in 4 months. I let the silence sit. Part of me wanted to rage, but his posture was already doing more damage than my anger could. "Did you know about the drugs?" I asked. He shook his head hard. "I swear. She told me he was confused. I believed her because the money made it easy." He finally met my eyes. "What do you need?" I told him about the emails, the hospital records, and the criminal investigation being built against Glenda. When I finished, he was crying quietly. "I will testify, whatever it takes." It was not forgiveness, but it was leverage. That evening, my phone rang. Oak Ridge Meadows HOA is on the caller ID. I answered and heard Glenda's voice, still carrying that practiced sweetness. "Ethan, I think there has been a terrible misunderstanding. I received some aggressive legal correspondence today, and I believe we can resolve this like reasonable people. Meet me tomorrow at the HOA office, just the two of us. I have a proposal that will make this entire situation disappear." Rachel was listening on the speaker. She raised an eyebrow but said nothing. I thought about what kind of person shows up at a funeral to stake a claim on a dead man's land before his casket hits the dirt. I thought about the email where she promised to handle my grandfather personally. I thought about the tea and the sedatives and the signature he could not remember giving. "What time?" I asked, keeping my voice neutral. 10 a.m., Glenda said. "And Ethan, come alone." I ended the call without agreeing to her terms. Rachel was already making notes. "She is scared," she said. "Scared people make mistakes." I looked at the root cellar hatch and the kit Dr. William Patterson floor. Tomorrow, I would hear whatever offer Glenda thought could buy my silence. But tonight, Marcus Webb and I were going to find out what my grandfather had hidden in the dark. The root cellar hatch was swollen from moisture and age. It took both Marcus Webb and me pulling together to wrench it free. He descended first with a flashlight, and I followed into the cool darkness below. The space was smaller than I remembered, maybe 10 feet by 12, with shelves of old preserves lining the stone walls. But in the far corner, partially hidden behind feed sacks, sat something that did not belong, a second VCR unit connected to a car battery still holding a faint charge, with 4 VHS tapes stacked neatly beside it. Marcus let out a low whistle. "Your grandfather was smarter than they gave him credit for. He ran a parallel recording system. The VCR in the shed was the decoy. This was his insurance policy." He examined the tapes, each labeled in my grandfather's shaky handwriting with dates: September 4th, September 11th, September 15th, and September 18th, the day he supposedly signed away his land. "Are you ready to see what he wanted you to find?" I nodded. We carried the equipment upstairs. The first 3 tapes established a pattern. Glenda arrived unannounced on each visit, always carrying something: homemade bread, a casserole, a thermos of tea. She would sit with my grandfather for an hour or more, asking about his health, his family, and his plans for the property. On the September 15th tape, she mentioned that several neighbors had already agreed to sell their land for community development. "You would be doing such a good thing for Oak Ridge," she told him, "and you would not have to worry about maintaining all this acreage alone anymore." My grandfather's response was barely audible, but his body language was unmistakable. He leaned away from her, his arms crossed over his chest. He shook his head repeatedly. The visit ended with Glenda's smile frozen in place, her eyes hard as she walked out the door. The September 18th tape began at 2:17 p.m. according to the timestamp. My grandfather was sitting on the sofa, looking tired but alert. When Glenda let herself in through the kit Dr. William Patterson door, she was carrying a ceramic teapot decorated with flowers. "I brought you something special today. Walter, chamomile, and lavender, good for helping you relax." She set the teapot on the counter, glanced toward the living room to confirm my grandfather was not watching, then reached into her purse. She withdrew a small amber prescription bottle, the same one I had found after the funeral. She opened it, shook 4 pills into her palm, and dropped them one by one into the teapot. 4 tablets of zolpidem, 10 milligrams each, 40 milligrams total, 4 times the maximum recommended dose. She stirred the tea, poured a cup, and carried it to my grandfather with that same warm smile. He drank the tea. Over the next 20 minutes, his words began to slur, his head drooped, his eyes lost focus. At 2:43 p.m., Glenda pulled a document from her bag, the fraudulent transfer agreement. "Walter, this is that insurance paperwork we discussed," she said slowly, like she was addressing a child. "I just need you to sign right here." His hand trembled as she guided a pen into his grip. He made a mark that barely resembled his signature. Then Glenda pressed his thumb into an ink pad and rolled it onto the paper. His eyes were nearly closed, his head lolled against the sofa, and then Glenda straightened, looking at the completed document with quiet satisfaction. "Done," she said to no one. $15 million. That was easier than it should have been. The tape continued for another hour, showing Glenda searching the house methodically. She found the VCR in the storage shed and took it with her when she left. She never thought to check the root cellar. She never imagined that a man she dismissed as senile had outsmarted her with technology older than she was. Marcus made digital copies of all 4 tapes while I sat in silence, watching my grandfather's face frozen on the screen, the confusion in his eyes, the way his hand moved without his control, the complete absence of understanding in anything he did that afternoon. Rachel Donovan arrived within the hour. She watched the September 18th tape twice without speaking, her legal pad filling with notes. When it ended, she turned to me with an expression that mixed professional focus with controlled anger. "This changes everything," she said. "The dosage she administered could have killed him. We need to request an autopsy immediately. If repeated sedative poisoning contributed to his death, we are not just looking at elder abuse and fraud. We are looking at criminally negligent homicide, possibly worse." She paused. "I am calling the district attorney tonight. Howard Preston owes me a favor, and this is exactly the kind of case his office wants. High profile, clear evidence, documented pattern of exploitation." She gestured at the television, where my grandfather's slumped form was still visible. "This tape alone meets every element of exploitation of an at-risk adult under Section 18-6.5-103. The prior visits establish premeditation. The Pinnacle emails establish a financial motive. And her statement at the end, that casual admission that it was easier than it should have been, shows consciousness of guilt." Marcus finished transferring the files to multiple secure locations, a cloud server, an encrypted drive, and a copy that Rachel locked in her office safe. Chain of custody documentation was prepared for eventual court submission. Everything my grandfather had tried to preserve was now protected in ways Glenda could not touch. "What about the meeting tomorrow?" I asked Rachel. "The one where she wanted me to come alone." Rachel considered for a moment. "Go. Hear what she has to say. She does not know these tapes exist, which means she still thinks she has leverage. Whatever she offers will tell us how desperate she really is." She looked at the frozen image on the screen one more time. "But you are not going alone. I will be parked outside with my phone recording, and if she says anything incriminating, we add it to the file." I looked at the television, at my grandfather, helpless on his own sofa. By this time tomorrow, Glenda Thornton would begin to understand that her entire world was about to collapse. The meeting at the HOA office was never about negotiation. I understood that the moment I walked in and saw Glenda Thornton sitting behind her desk, with the practiced composure of someone who still believed she held all the cards. Rachel Donovan was parked across the street, recording, and I had a device in my jacket capturing every word. "Ethan, thank you for coming," Glenda said. "I know we got off on the wrong foot, but your grandfather was confused at the end, making accusations that did not make sense. I think you have been misled by people who want to profit from your grief." She offered $200,000 for a release acknowledging the transfer's validity. When I declined, her smile tightened. "That is very generous, Ethan. I would hate for this to become uglier than it needs to be." What she did not know was that the day before, Rachel had delivered the video evidence to District Attorney Howard Preston. By the time I sat across from Glenda listening to her threats, a criminal investigation had already been opened. The first domino fell 2 days later. Marcus Webb called with news that Glenda had offered him $100,000 to lose the original tapes and testify that the digital copies were AI fabrications. "She used a burner phone, thought she was being clever," he said. "I recorded everything and sent it to the DA 20 minutes ago. Attempted bribery of a witness, a separate felony charge she had handed to prosecutors herself. That recording triggered an expansion of the investigation, which triggered subpoenas for HOA financial records, which triggered panic among the board members who had spent years looking the other way. The emergency board meeting that Glenda called became her next disaster. She demanded solidarity against what she described as a coordinated smear campaign, but the other members had received their own visits from investigators. Bernard Kessler broke first. The vice president, who had stood beside her at my grandfather's funeral, announced he had retained separate counsel and would cooperate fully with the district attorney. 2 others immediately followed. By the meeting's end, Glenda stood alone, insisting everything was under control while her 18-year empire crumbled around her. Her response was to escalate publicly, which only accelerated the collapse. The HOA newsletter went out to 2,800 households. With Glenda's version of events, an ungrateful heir was using sophisticated AI to fabricate evidence against a dedicated community servant. She demanded residents stand with the HOA against this attack. The backlash was immediate. Comments flooded in asking why she had not released documentation, proving the transfer was legitimate. A petition began circulating within hours, demanding an independent audit of all HOA finances for the past 5 years. The community she had controlled for nearly 2 decades was turning against her, and every defensive move she made gave them another reason to doubt. The regulatory response came faster than anyone expected. Rachel's complaint to the Colorado Division of Real Estate had triggered a formal review, and Dora's preliminary findings were damning enough to suspend the HOA's authority to conduct any real estate transactions pending investigation. That suspension froze the Pinnacle deal in place. Victor Harlan's response arrived the same day Pinnacle Development was terminating its memorandum of understanding and would pursue legal action to recover its $500,000 deposit plus $2 million in damages. The financial catastrophe Glenda had been racing to prevent had arrived anyway, brought down by her own desperation. The autopsy results delivered the final blow. Dr. Margaret Sullivan, the county medical examiner, found evidence of zolpidem accumulation in my grandfather's tissue samples, consistent with repeated administration over 4 to 6 weeks before his death. Not enough to rule it homicide outright, but enough to establish a pattern of chronic sedative exposure that significantly impaired his cognitive function during the final weeks of his life. Someone had been drugging Walter Whitfield systematically, not just on September 18th, but for more than a month. Every cup of tea Glenda brought to his house had likely contained enough to keep him confused, compliant, and unable to resist. I received the report on a Thursday evening, sitting on my grandfather's porch, looking at the wheat fields he had worked for 67 years. I felt something I had been suppressing since his funeral. Not grief alone, but a cold, patient anger. Glenda had spent weeks poisoning a man who trusted her, eroding his mind one visit at a time, then taking everything his family had built. She had done it for $450,000, and she had smiled through every cup of tea she handed him. The HOA annual meeting was scheduled for the following Tuesday. 350 residents would gather at the community center to elect board members and hear reports on neighborhood business. Glenda had no choice but to attend. She was running for her 7th consecutive term as president, and abandoning the race would be an admission she could not afford. The DA was still building his case, not yet ready for an arrest. He wanted to observe how she behaved as the walls closed in. Rachel called me that evening with a proposal that would give him exactly what he needed. "How would you feel about presenting your evidence directly to the community?" she asked. "The video, the emails, the autopsy findings. Let 350 of her neighbors see what their HOA president has been doing in their name. Let them watch her react when she realizes the tape survived." I thought about my grandfather, about the confusion in his eyes on that September afternoon, about the signature he could not remember making. I thought about Glenda's words on the tape. That was easier than it should have been. She had spent 18 years building power in this community. She had used that power to steal from vulnerable people who trusted her, and in 5 days, she was going to stand in front of everyone she had fooled and watch it all come apart. "Tell me what you need me to do," I said. The Oak Ridge Meadows Community Center was built to hold 300 people. On the night of the annual meeting, 350 residents packed into every available seat, with another 40 standing along the walls. Word had spread that something significant was going to happen. The local news had sent a camera crew after receiving an anonymous tip, and someone had set up a live stream that would eventually reach 89,000 viewers. I arrived early with Rachel Donovan and took a seat in the 3rd row, close enough to see every expression on Glenda Thornton's face when her world collapsed. She was already at the front table, shuffling papers and projecting the calm authority she had cultivated for 18 years. She did not look at me. She still believed she was in control. The meeting began with standard business budget reports, maintenance updates, and a parking dispute that generated more passion than it deserved. Glenda presided with practiced efficiency, steering discussions away from anything controversial. When the agenda reached board elections, She stood to deliver her campaign speech for a 7th consecutive term. "I have dedicated 18 years to this community," she said. "I have been attacked recently by individuals who want to undermine everything we have built together. They have spread lies through legal channels and attempted to destroy someone who has only ever served Oak Ridge Meadows with integrity." She paused. "I am asking for your trust one more time. Stand with me against those who would tear our community apart." The applause was scattered. I waited until it faded, then raised my hand. "Point of order, Madam President. Under Bylaws, Article 7, Section 3, any resident has the right to respond to statements made during official proceedings." Glenda's composure flickered before the mask returned. "The floor recognizes Ethan Whitfield." I walked to the front and faced 350 people who had no idea what they were about to see. My grandfather, Walter Whitfield, lived adjacent to this community for 82 years, 5 weeks before he died. Someone obtained his signature on a document transferring his 1,200 acres, worth $15 million, to this HOA for $1. Murmurs rippled through the crowd. "I have evidence that this signature was obtained through criminal means. You have the right to see it." Rachel had arranged access to the projection system. When I nodded, Marcus Webb pressed play. The footage began with Glenda entering my grandfather's kit doctor, William Patterson, on September 18th at 2:17 p.m., carrying a ceramic teapot. The room went silent as 350 people watched her glance toward the living room, reach into her purse, and drop 4 pills into the tea. They watched her carry the cup to an 82-year-old man and smile while he drank. They watched him grow confused over 20 minutes, his words slurring, his head drooping. They watched Glenda guide a pen into his trembling hand and press his thumb onto an ink pad. And they heard her voice say, "Done. $15 million. That was easier than it should have been." The video ended. For 3 seconds, no one moved. Then the room erupted. People shouted questions, demanded explanations, and turned to Glenda with expressions of shock and fury. She stood frozen, her face pale, her authority disintegrating in real time. "That video is fake," she said, her voice cracking. "It is artificial intelligence. Anyone can create these things now." She pointed at me with a trembling finger. "This man has not visited his grandfather in 12 years. He does not care about Walter. He only cares about the money." Eugene Whitfield rose slowly from his seat in the 5th row. He was 78 years old, my grandfather's closest friend for 6 decades, with hands weathered by a lifetime of farming. "I have known Walter Whitfield since 1962, he said, "and I know analog video equipment. Glenda, I installed the same cameras on my own property 30 years ago." He pointed at the frozen image on the screen. "That timestamp is burned into magnetic tape. That interference pattern is characteristic of VHS recording. There is no artificial intelligence that can replicate the specific degradation of analog footage." He looked directly at her. "That video is real. Everyone in this room knows it." The crowd noise swelled, angrier now. Glenda's eyes darted around the room, searching for allies. Bernard Kessler would not meet her gaze. The other board members had physically distanced themselves from her chair. Sheriff Dale Hancock stood near the back exit with 2 deputies. And something inside Glenda Thornton finally broke. "You do not understand," she shouted, slamming her palm on the table. "That old man was sitting on $15 million and refusing to do anything with it. 1,200 acres are going to waste while this community needs room to grow. I tried to reason with him for months. He would not listen." Her voice rose higher. "I built this HOA. I made Oak Ridge Meadows what it is. Walter Whitfield was too stubborn to see that his land was worth more as part of something bigger." The room went silent. Every phone was recording. The news camera focused on her face. Glenda seemed to realize what she had just admitted in front of 350 witnesses and a live stream audience. Her mouth opened and closed. Then she grabbed her purse and pushed toward the side exit, shoving past residents who recoiled from her. She made it through the door into the parking lot. 3 police cars were waiting with their lights off. District Attorney Howard Preston stood beside the lead vehicle. "Glenda Thornton, you are under arrest for exploitation of an at-risk adult, forgery, fraud, attempted bribery, and conspiracy. You have the right to remain silent." Deputies moved forward with handcuffs. The crowd from inside had followed her out, phones still recording, watching as the woman who had controlled their neighborhood for 18 years was placed in the back of a patrol car. Rachel appeared beside me. "Warrant was signed 2 hours ago. They were waiting." That was all she needed to say. Glenda had given them everything they needed and more. The patrol car pulled away, and the crowd began to disperse, speaking in hushed voices about what they had witnessed. I stood in the parking lot where my grandfather's funeral procession had passed weeks earlier, watching the red taillights disappear. Eugene Whitfield walked over slowly, his weathered hand resting briefly on my shoulder. "Walter would be proud of you," he said quietly. "He always said you would be the one to protect the land." I did not trust my voice. I just nodded and watched until the police cars were gone. The night was cold and clear, the kind of autumn evening my grandfather had loved. Somewhere in the back of a patrol car, Glenda Thornton was beginning to understand that 18 years of power meant nothing when the truth finally caught up. And somewhere beneath this same sky, my grandfather rested in the family cemetery he had chosen for himself, surrounded by 4 generations of Whitfields who had worked this land before him. I had made a promise when I found those tapes. Tonight, I kept it. The trial lasted 11 days. Glenda Thornton's defense attorney tried every strategy available, challenging the authenticity of the video evidence, questioning the chain of custody, and arguing that my grandfather had been a willing participant who simply changed his mind. None of it worked. The FBI forensics lab had verified that the VHS tapes showed no signs of tampering or digital manipulation. Dr. Margaret Sullivan testified about the autopsy findings, explaining in clinical detail how repeated zolpidem exposure over 4 to 6 weeks had impaired my grandfather's cognitive function. The hospital records from September 19th documented symptoms consistent with acute sedative poisoning, and the Pinnacle development emails, authenticated by the company's own IT department under subpoena, proved that Glenda had planned the theft months in advance for a personal payout of $450,000. The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours before returning guilty verdicts on all counts. Judge Catherine Aldridge delivered the sentence on a gray November morning, exactly 7 months after my grandfather's funeral. The courtroom was packed with residents from Oak Ridge Meadows, many of whom had driven 45 minutes to witness the conclusion of a case that had consumed their community. Glenda sat at the defense table in a plain gray suit, her silver hair now streaked with white, her face carrying the weight of someone who had watched everything she built collapse around her. The judge reviewed each charge methodically: exploitation of an at-risk adult, a Class 3 felony carrying a presumptive range of 4 to 12 years, forgery, a Class 5 felony, fraud, a Class 4 felony, attempted bribery of a witness, and conspiracy to commit theft. The defendant exploited a position of trust within her community to systematically target and victimize a vulnerable elderly man, Judge Aldridge said. She used chemical means to impair his judgment, obtained his signature through deception, and then attempted to cover her crimes through intimidation and bribery. The court finds no mitigating factors that would justify leniency. She sentenced Glenda Thornton to 12 years in the Colorado Department of Corrections, with eligibility for parole after serving a minimum of 8 years. The civil judgments followed over the next several weeks. Rachel Donovan had filed suit against Glenda personally, the HOA board members as individuals, and the Oak Ridge Meadows HOA as an entity. The damages were substantial: $1.8 million awarded to me for emotional distress, legal costs, and the attempted theft of property valued at $15 million. The HOA's liability insurance refused to cover claims arising from criminal conduct, which meant the judgment would be paid from the association's reserve funds and, if necessary, through special assessments on member properties. The irony was not lost on anyone. The community Glenda claimed to have served for 18 years would now bear the financial consequences of her crimes. Bernard Kessler received 2 years of probation and 200 hours of community service in exchange for his cooperation with prosecutors. His testimony had helped establish the pattern of self-dealing among board members, documenting how consulting fees from the Pinnacle deal had been structured to avoid disclosure requirements. The 3 other board members who had participated in the scheme received sentences ranging from 3 to 5 years, plus fines totaling $450,000. The Colorado Division of Real Estate permanently revoked all their licenses and issued a public censure that would follow them for the rest of their careers. Pinnacle Development Corporation paid $750,000 in administrative penalties after investigators determined that company executives had been aware that the land acquisitions involved questionable methods. Victor Harlan resigned as CEO 3 weeks after the settlement was announced. Sheriff Dale Hancock never faced criminal charges, but an internal affairs investigation concluded that he had failed to properly investigate credible allegations of elder abuse due to personal relationships with the accused. He was given the option to resign with partial pension benefits or face a formal disciplinary hearing that would likely result in termination. He chose resignation, effective immediately, and moved to Arizona 2 months later. His wife, Meredith, who had served on the HOA board but was not directly implicated in the land scheme, filed for divorce before the year ended. My uncle Raymond kept his word. He testified against Glenda at trial, describing in detail how she had approached him 5 months before my grandfather's death with an offer of $75,000 to help manage family resistance to the land transfer. His voice broke several times during cross-examination, but he never wavered from the truth. The district attorney declined to prosecute him in exchange for his cooperation, though the court ordered him to complete 200 hours of community service and repay the money Glenda had promised him. Even though he had never actually received it, the $75,000 went to a county fund supporting victims of elder abuse. Raymond and I have not fully reconciled, and I am not sure we ever will, but he sends me a letter every few months, updating me on his life, asking about the farm. I read them. I do not always reply. Some wounds take longer to heal than others. The Oak Ridge Meadows HOA was dissolved by court order 6 months after Glenda's conviction. An independent auditor had discovered financial irregularities going back more than a decade, including unreported consulting fees, conflicts of interest in vendor contracts, and reserve fund investments that had benefited board members personally. The $2.3 million remaining in HOA accounts after legal settlements was distributed to a court-appointed receiver, who used it to pay outstanding debts and refund a portion of dues to homeowners who had been members during the period of misconduct. A new homeowners association was formed with completely revised bylaws, including mandatory financial audits, term limits for board members, and a provision that became known informally as the Whitfield Clause. No HOA action could affect adjacent agricultural properties without unanimous consent of the affected landowners and independent legal review. I never moved back to Denver. The architecture firm held my position for 3 months before we mutually agreed that my future lay elsewhere. I live in my grandfather's farmhouse now, sleeping in the same bedroom where he spent his final years, cooking in the kit Dr. William Patterson, where Glenda poisoned him with tea she claimed was made with love. The first thing I did after the trial ended was walk to the front gate where that for sale sign had stood on the day of his funeral. The posts were still there, driven into soil that 4 generations of Whitfields had cultivated. I pulled them out with my bare hands, one by one, and burned the pieces in the fire pit behind the barn. Eugene Whitfield helped me make the new sign. He is 78 years old, and his hands shake slightly now, but he still remembers the woodworking skills his father taught him during the Depression. We chose oak for the posts and cedar for the face, woods that will weather but not rot, that will still be standing when I am gone, and whoever comes after me takes up the work of protecting this place. The letters are carved deep and painted white against the dark grain. Whitfield Family Farm, established 1958, private property, not for sale. Below that, in smaller letters, in memory of Walter James Whitfield, who knew the truth and made sure it survived. I visit his grave every Sunday morning, in the small family cemetery that holds 4 generations of Whitfields. I bring coffee and sit on the bench I built beside his headstone, and I tell him about the farm, about the wheat coming up, or the fence that needs mending, or the neighbor who stopped by to share vegetables from her garden. Sometimes I tell him about the trial, about the sentence, about the people who reached out to say they were sorry for what happened to him and what was almost done to his land. I don't know if he can hear me. I do not know if any of it matters to whatever part of him still exists somewhere beyond this field, but it matters to me. On my last visit, I brought a single stalk of wheat from the first harvest I completed on my own, gold and heavy with grain, and laid it against his headstone. The wind came up from the west, carrying the smell of autumn and wood smoke from a distant chimney. The wheat stalks in the field bent and whispered, the same sound they have made on this land for 67 years. And I sat there with my grandfather, in the silence and the wind, and I knew that some things cannot be stolen. Some things, if you fight hard enough, you get to keep. What Glenda Thornton did to Walter Whitfield happens every day across America. HOAs abuse their power. Elderly homeowners are pressured, manipulated, and robbed of the property they spent a lifetime building. Most of these stories never get told. If this story moved you, if it made you angry, if it reminded you why accountability matters, then you are exactly the audience we created this channel for.